the overall trade balance between the Pacific Alliance countries and the Republic of South Korea. So we can see, for example, we heard the story that Ramón was telling us. We have some very positive views from Chile. We have, in the case of Peru, also very positive views because Chile and Peru have benefit. I mean, they see the agreement as beneficial, and they have been able to also export new agricultural products. In the case of Peru, I mean, they usually in the I mean their biggest share in exports is mining products, but they have been able to open markets for foodstuff, for example, superfood, quinoa, and many other products. And we have a different story in the cases of Colombia and Mexico, who in fact have the biggest, I mean, from their perspective, they have a trade deficit with South Korea. And as Jean-Marie mentioned, in both countries, there are growing concerns regarding some sectors, specifically regarding vehicles and automotive cars. I mean, automotive parts. Therefore, you can see that not all countries share the same view regarding the effects of the free trade agreements. Of course, the trade balance alone does not tell us the whole complexity of the relationship, but it shows us some very interesting points. I would like to take the chance to also discuss, for example, the case of Colombia and Peru. I mean, it is not only because of the free trade agreement that there is a difference in their trade balance. I mean, historically, both countries, and I'm here talking about a little bit of Mexico and Colombia. I mean, historically, the products that they trade and the characteristics of their export basket are very particular. So we find that on the Pacific Alliance side, these countries are they mostly export mining and oil products, but they are trying to diversify their exports towards new products and new areas. However, we see differences in this sense, and I would like to point out that in the case of Colombia, for example, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects of this phenomenon on the economy, imports from the Republic of Korea have decreased during the last year, which constitutes an important challenge for South Korea and the other Pacific Alliance countries. So I would like to jump onto the investment. Tell me more about the characteristics of investment between the two parties. Jean-Marie?
There is quite a long history of Korean investment in Mexico, mainly to build factories to gain access to the North American market. So it dates back to the 1980s, and the relationship is very strong. There is Mexico is the first destination of Korean investment in Latin America. And so it's a historical and very strong relationship. There was a bilateral investment treaty that was signed in 2000, and the perspective is changing quite a little bit because there is a recent diversification in terms of investment. As I said, it was at first the main objective was the access to the North American markets, especially the US market, and in terms of automotive parts, in terms of electro-domestic appliances. But it's changing. And over the last few years, we've seen more and more investment in renewable energies, in technology. So there is a changing relationship that it's interesting to look at. And the historical strength of the relationship is still important today, but the transformation is also interesting because we can imagine, because investment is a good way to see how different stakeholders imagine the future of the economic relationship. If they're investing not for today, but for tomorrow. And the change towards renewable energy, toward technology, is an interesting sign, and the Mexican market itself becomes more important for Korean investors.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. Ramón?
I think in the case of Chile, the situation is a bit different from Mexico, right? Because there is no investment, for example, to build factories. The investment is more directed towards the mining, hydrocarbons, and energy sectors. And you see mergers and acquisitions. You see investment from Korean firms acquiring stakes in Chilean companies. So you see, for example, Cores, which is the Korean Resources Corporation, getting a 30% stake in Santo Domingo project, which is a mining project in Chile. You see Samsung C&T and Cores acquiring mining assets in Chile as well. LG in the hydrocarbons sector. So you see this type of investment, which you could argue is beneficial for the Chilean economy. Insofar, this allows for projects to proceed. But as I said, you don't see Korean companies building new factories in the case of Chile, which is something obviously the Chilean government would like to encourage, but hasn't happened so far. You also see some greenfield investment. So you see investment in new projects. For example, POSCO has been quite active, has received a contract in the past to build a coal-fired power station, which was the first actually time that a Korean company built this type of facility, not only in Chile, but across the whole of Latin America. You also see Chilean companies that have signed supply agreements with Korean companies. So this also allows them to boost their production because they know they have a client who is going to buy their production. So you have SQM in Chile that signed a deal actually last year, so a few months ago, with LG Energy to supply lithium. So you see this type of investment. You see less investment from SMEs. You don't really see much investment from small, medium-sized enterprises from Korea into Chile. So most of the investment actually comes from the big conglomerates, the big table that I think are fairly well known across the world, really, right? Like Samsung or LG or POSCO, for example.
Thank you, Ramon. There is a trend that we see in many of the countries. For example, in the cases of Peru and Colombia, we also see investment coming from big companies, investment being directed mostly to mining, manufacturing sectors. And there is an interesting trend that I would like to highlight, and it's investment and cooperation in terms of public procurement. In the case of Colombia, for example, Korean companies have provided services, transportation services in the city of Bogota and in Medellin. And this is an issue that I think comes out from the free trade agreement, because we have public procurement chapters in some of these agreements, and from there we can see investment coming into the region. And also, I think there are opportunities for further investment in these sectors. Also, I would like to highlight that there are opportunities for further investment from Korean companies in Latin America. And the case of Colombia is very particular. Based on the free trade, based on the peace agreement that the government established with former guerrilla members, there are tax exemptions trying to attract companies and foreign investment towards agricultural sectors and new companies to be located in very specific areas. But the situation in both Colombia and Peru is very similar to what Ramón already described. We see a lot incoming investment, but not as much outgoing investment from the Pacific Alliance members towards South Korea. And that raises questions about why is it that there isn't more investment on that direction. And some of the issues that we could identify is that in many cases, business people do not know well the market, the Korean market. They do not, and something very similar happens for exports from the Pacific Alliance towards South Korea. Many of the people who answered the survey from the private sector suggested they do not fully understand the Korean market. They do not fully understand the business culture. They fear limitations, for example, for investment, because they see as a limitation the high wages in Korea. So from this specific element, I think we could also further discuss alternatives and probably strategies on both sides to overcome some of these limitations. We spent already 30 minutes, and I would like to ask you a little bit more about other issues. For example, we are looking at the free trade agreement and how it has influenced trade, investment. And before we move to some of your suggestions and recommendations to improve or strengthen the relationship, I would like also to ask you about how has been cooperation traditionally between South Korea and the case studies you explored. Ramón?
Sorry, you cut for a second. What was the question? Sorry, I couldn't hear the question for a second.
Sorry, I'm back. No, I was saying before we move to the recommendations, I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit of the historical cooperation experience between the Republic of Korea and the Pacific Alliance members, and a little bit of the history of these relationships.
So the case of Korea and Chile is interesting because they share a history, right? So during the 1960s, 70s, right, there was these coups, military coups in both of them, and we had anti-communist dictatorial regimes in both countries that actually brought them together, but also democracy was restored more or less at the same time. So 1987 in the case of Korea, 1990 in the case of Chile, and this gave us this ideological alignment. And you see from the 1990s, after the transition to democracy, that you see pretty much every single Chilean president visiting Korea. Obviously not only because of the ideological affinity of the recent transition to democracy, but also because of the business opportunities that already in the 1990s many Chilean policymakers and business people thought were possible with Korea. You have also reciprocal visits from Korean presidents going to Chile, and then I think from the perspective of both countries, actually, this was, as I said before, right? This was the first FTA negotiation for a Korean government, right? So in the late 1990s, when Korea decided that they wanted to have bilateral agreements and not only multilateral agreements, Chile was the first partner that it identified in the Pacific Alliance for Latin American region. But also interestingly for Chile, this was the first FTA not with countries in its neighborhood, right, in the Americas, or with the European Union, the US, so the big two. So it was the first FTA, so to speak, of with a country some similar size of economy back then, a country with which Chile didn't really have historically a strong economic relations or geographical relations. So historically, I mean, from political point of view, this was an interesting development for Chile as well. It is fair to say that the negotiation process was very useful for both of them. Again, going into the history, because in the case of Korea, I realized how difficult it is actually to sign an FTA, how many stakeholders at the domestic level you have to bring on board, and similarly for Chile, I realized that signing FTAs with countries with which, in theory, there are strong complementarities is not always a straightforward process. So the political component of discussing an FTA was also important. And today, in terms of politics, there is a very good working relationship between both of them, not only at the bilateral level, but also within multilateral institutions. So you could argue that dating back to the 1990s, transition to democracy, the strong political relations coming together with deepening economic relations have really flourished during this period of time.
Thank you, Ramon, for that wonderful overview of the historic relationship between these two parties. Jean-Marie, what can you tell us?
Oh, it's an interesting case, the relationship between Mexico and South Korea in terms of political cooperation. And both countries have been quite active over well, in the 21st century in order to foment multilateral governance, different forums and dialogue. And they are both participating to the G20. They are both part of this informal alliance between Mexico, Indonesia, the South Korea, Turkey, and Australia, MICTA. And so they're quite active countries on the global diplomatic scene, in order to find new forms of multilateral governance, to reactivate some different forums. And they're also increasingly cooperating. It's still small, but they're both countries that were recipients of foreign aid historically, and they've been changing to donor countries, and they're establishing a triangular relationship, for example, to assist countries in Central America and the Caribbean between a South Korea Cooperation Agency and a Mexican Cooperation Agency. So the political part of the cooperation is important, and it has been strengthening over the last few years. So there is a strong relationship there.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. And in terms of cooperation and looking back at history, for example, the case of Colombia is really iconic. We, I mean, as part of this project, we had an special event commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. And every time we talk about the cooperation between Colombia and South Korea, we need to go back at some point at the participation of the Colombian army supporting the United Nations forces during the Korean War. And as many diplomats agree, that has been a main instrument of the diplomatic relationship. And from there, cooperation has been building up. For example, South Korea has been an active donor, and it always commemorates these events and the veterans. And nowadays, during the COVID-19 pandemic, South Korea has been an active donor also, I mean, for Colombia and for Peru, providing technical assistance, medical and testing kits to face these important and in some cases devastating phenomenon that we are facing. And I would like, in terms of cooperation and the political relationship, I would like to highlight that we found possibilities for new forms of cooperation, particularly in terms of trade, in terms of investment, and in terms of fostering cultural and a better understanding of the different actors in this scenario. And for example, we will jump to some recommendations that in fact we will deeply discuss next Thursday when we present the more policy-oriented approach of the report. But I would like to again highlight the important role that, for example, trade facilitation or trade-related development assistance could have in the future. Ramón and Jean-Marie were describing the historical relationship between the parties, and I think we like to focus on the past. And in the past, there were some very iconic moments, there were some very iconic issues that have contributed to the relationship, but there was also a long period of time, decades, when the two regions were not so connected, when trade and investment were not that active. And what we are seeing is that since 1999, when the negotiations with Chile started, the whole dynamic has been a lot more active, and it tells us a lot about the strategic importance of the relationship and how we should start looking into the future of the relationship. We know what has happened in the past. We know what is going on right now. Both sides, I mean, on both sides of the Atlantic, there are initiatives to update the free trade agreements, to advance a better understanding, to foster trade and investment ties. And I mean, we really think that we need to start looking at these relationships with new eyes, looking at the 21st century and the challenges that the international scenario poses. Very briefly, from your cases, what do you think? I mean, I'm not going to the policy recommendations. I'm going to jump on what do you think are the most relevant issues that should be considered in the next years? What should policymakers, academics, and anyone interested in this relationship be looking into?
I think on the case in the case of Chile, there are two main issues to consider. One of them is already being discussed by the governments of the two countries, which is the updating of the FTA. It was signed before the digital economy boomed. So, for example, there is no chapter on e-commerce. Investment provisions don't really focus on the new economy that has emerged over the past 15 to 20 years and has been accelerated by the pandemic. And I think this same discussion we're having today shows that, right? Now there are many more, for example, online discussions, right? And obviously this can be used for economic activities as well. And the second point is how to boost investment even further. So Chilean companies, they have gained an important share of the market for foodstuff, obviously for copper, etc. as well. But if we focus on foodstuff, as South Korean consumers move towards more sustainable crops, right, and they become more demanding, well, Chile is well placed to boost the export of foodstuff to South Korea. And if we look in that direction, for example, the export of cultural products from South Korea to Chile, this could be boosted. If we look at Korean culture, it has become increasingly popular across the world, including in Latin America itself and in the Pacific Alliance countries, but in Chile less so than in other countries in the region and across the continent. So I think this is something that could be promoted further. And there's one last point in which you could see the relationship moving forward, which is a cooperation between startups and entrepreneurs in both countries. South Korea has a thriving startup scene with I think it's the second largest number of unicorns in the whole of Asia after China. So there is money flowing into the startup ecosystem in South Korea, and Chile, Santiago especially, also has a strong startup ecosystem. So there could be more cooperation between startups and entrepreneurs in both sides of the Pacific.
Thank you, Ramón. Jean-Marie?
Yeah, before we go into like more specific recommendations or even that something that you will develop in the next workshop, the main issue that should like guide further research or try to think about the evolution of policy and economic relationship between the two countries is the changing global context. So I think it's very important to highlight, although it's quite obvious, that we have two countries in terms of Mexico and South Korea that share some similarities in terms of the size of their economy, but also the specific relationship they have developed with a giant economy, neighboring economy, China in the case of South Korea and the US in the case of Mexico. And both countries are trying to diversify their trade and economic relations in general in order to not to be too dependent on these giant economies, because we know that in an uncertain global context that it's this relationship might have some issues. For example, the trade war between China and the US has affected neighboring countries. So it's very important to see that these countries need to diversify, and they do have some complementarities in terms of trade. They do have some interest, shared interest in terms of global governance. They do have some opportunities in terms of bilateral investments. So that would be like the main issue that I would like to look into, the global evolving context and how these countries, and I'm talking about bilateral relationship, but we can go back to the Pacific Alliance and Republic of Korea relationship in general. This is something to strengthen in order to build some new or not new, but more stable and more strengthened relationship between different countries in different regions.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. I will add that in my opinion, I mean, besides what you already mentioned, something that should be addressed and that both we researchers and policy makers should be paying attention to is actually the role of the private sector and what happens. I mean, what happens with entrepreneurs, what happens with small and medium-sized enterprises, what are the barriers and the difficulties they face both ways to advance trade or investment or new initiatives, for example, in the middle of the digital economy, cultural industries, because we see a lot of optimism among among the public sector and policymakers, but there are significant questions and worries among business people and among different sectors. So I think that should be a major issue, as well as looking into the role of promotion agencies. For example, what COTRA does, what Pro Chile, Pro Peru, or Pro Colombia do, and how these agencies can connect the business people on both sides of the Pacific. That is on the bilateral level. At the multilateral level, I think we will be discussing this for years to come, and is whether or not or how is going to continue or advance the negotiation among Pacific Alliance members and South Korea, and whether South Korea is going to be able to join as an associate member, particularly because there are two preconditions for that to happen. The first will be completing the ongoing negotiations that the Pacific Alliance is carrying out with Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Canada. And on the other hand, actually completing a free trade agreement with Mexico, which will be the door that will open new opportunities for this relationship. We have various participants on WebEx and also on YouTube. So we have 10 more minutes, and I would like to listen to some of our participants or to read some of the questions they can send on the chat. So the floor is all yours. We welcome all questions and comments. If you are not familiar with this platform, you can on the bottom part of the window, you will find the chat. You can write your questions there, or you can try to raise your hand right next to your name. I don't see any questions yet. So I'll go back to you, and while we wait for some questions or comments, don't be shy. This is an interesting experience also for all of us to carry out these events online. So meanwhile, Ramón, Jean-Marie, what would you like to add? What would you like for people to take from this short presentation?
I think a couple of things that we haven't mentioned, but that are important to understand. I think builds on what Jean-Marie has said, right? The global trade dynamics have really been changing. This could only be accelerated by COVID, because we see European countries, the US, suffering greatly in terms of GDP, and the response to the pandemic hasn't really been good, right? So I think that this relationship between South Korea and the Pacific Alliance, and Chile specifically in the case of the country that I studied, is only going to become more important. So this is certainly the discussion that you see in Korea these days, right? There has been a diversification already taking place. The South Korean government, South Korean firms were looking more at Southeast Asia, for example, in terms of business opportunities, in terms of trade, investment, tourism as well, actually. And now you see that the next step is really looking beyond the Asian context and strengthening relations further with the Americas, for example, right? And with the Pacific Alliance in particular. South Korea is considering joining CPTPP, which obviously would only strengthen relations with the Pacific Alliance countries as well. So I think the flows are only going to increase, and also they're going to diversify, and they're going to move beyond the traditional areas of South Korean investment in the mining sector, for example, in Chile, and selling cars to Chile, which is by far the largest export by value, and South Korea exporting minerals, Chile exporting minerals, and foodstuff to Chile. So I think this is going to take place well, probably starting as soon as the pandemic is over. This is strengthening bilateral economic relations. And the second aspect is, how does this look like in terms of cooperation at the global level? It is true that Chile obviously is not part of MICTA, for example, that was mentioned by Jean-Marie, in terms of relations between Mexico and South Korea. But it's also true that if anything, the trade war between the US and China, which is not really going away, it might take a different shape, but it's not really going away. Also, on the European Union side, you see more skepticism towards China as well. This can lead to cooperation in multilateral settings, right? So, for example, in the WTO, there could be more cooperation between South Korea and Pacific Alliance countries, because they actually benefit from these multilateral rules. When the big three, right, of the US, the EU, and China, they decide to act in a way that is actually detrimental to the multilateral institutions that they have set up. So this political-economic cooperation in multilateral settings, I think, is something. Certainly, the South Korean government has been pressing for this ever since the WTO was created, but also during the current trade war that we see between with China, and I think this is something that from which the countries in the Pacific Alliance would also benefit cooperation with South Korea in these settings.
Very interesting take, Ramon. Thank you. Jean-Marie, what would you like to add?
Just maybe the idea that we shouldn't focus only on economic relationship, as we've been discussing in the project. FTAs are not magical elements that will make trade thrive and economy grow. And in FTAs are just a framework, a legal framework, and for business to happen, for relationship to be strengthened, there is a need of some more non-directly economic relationship to be built. In terms of tourism, Ramon mentioned tourism. When the direct flight between Mexico and Korea just skyrocketed the number of tourists from South Korea to Mexico, and somehow also the other way around. So and this is important, because if you want to think about a new business or something, you have to visit the country, you have to see what's going on, you have to know a little bit of the culture. And this is something that we should stress also, the cultural relationship, the academic exchanges, the scientific cooperation. All of these are elements that are necessary in order to build a relationship for the future, not only the legal framework for the relationship, but also the real opportunities that come with more cultural or interpersonal ties.
Thank you both. That is a key element of I think, of the future of the relationship. We have the legal frameworks, but on both sides, we need a better understanding of the other. And we always discuss the importance of cultural relations and cultural exchanges, but this is true at every single level, even for the business context. And I see a question here from Leonardo. He says, we always speak in macroeconomic terms. I would like to know how you can connect medium-sized companies between the two. And I think I'll let you to answer the question, but before that, I would like to add that for many business sectors, it is complicated to understand the requirements on the other market. So a better understanding of the business culture, for example, on the Korean side, I mean, Pacific Alliance members, businesses to better understand the business culture in South Korea will be a very interesting asset. So how can what do you think? How can medium-sized enterprises between South Korea and the Pacific Alliance members connect, or how can they build stronger relationships?
Well, I agree with Jean-Marie, right? The FTA is not a magic weapon, right? It facilitates, it creates the framework, but it's about market knowledge. You see that both countries, the trade promotion agencies have been trying, in the case of Chile, have been trying to promote better knowledge about the other markets to facilitate access. It is fair to say that there are Korean firms that have been looking into this, medium and small size enterprises that have been looking into this, get market knowledge, but this hasn't really worked out. From their perspective, the Chilean market is difficult to crack compared to other countries in the Pacific Alliance context. So I would say that probably you would need economic support in this case from the Korean government to small and medium-sized enterprises to receive to invest in Chile itself and try to sell the products in Chile. There has been economic support for big conglomerates, so this could actually happen. And on the Chilean side, as you mentioned, Carolina, also in your presentation before, right? The lack of knowledge that sometimes business people mention when it comes to the South Korean market, right? It's very different from other countries in the Americas, for example, is hindering these stronger ties that there could be. So I think there could be more of an educational campaign from the South Korean government in Chile itself about investment opportunities that go beyond, you know, the macroeconomic components, but also the microeconomic components, how to do business in South Korea. Chile promotion agency, an investment promotion agency, sorry, has been trying to promote this, but I guess from a Chilean perspective, there are the countries that are low-hanging fruit because culturally they're closer to Chile. So maybe a bigger effort on both sides would be necessary.
Thank you. Thank you both for those interesting points, and thank you. I would like to thank all the people who participated in this workshop. We don't want to take too much of your time and want to keep these brief and interesting. So please, I think I'm sharing a slide with information about the upcoming report and the link to our website where you can find more information about everything that we have been doing and everything that we would like to share with you. At the same time, I would like to invite you, I mean, in this session, we discussed some general elements of the relationship, their characteristics, their evolution, some elements to look forward. And on Thursday, that we launch the report, we will be discussing more specific policy recommendations that could improve or help strengthening the current relationship between South Korea and the Pacific Alliance members. So I'm going to share with you the link down here for the website, and we will be sharing with you through email the research report and the policy brief that we have preparing. They will also be available online. And thank you all for joining us in this conversation, and we look forward to having you in some future events and discussions. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.